Freedom of religion has been quite frequently litigated in the courts and frequently talked about, but freedom of conscience has truly been not spoken of, really at all. In a nutshell, I argue that freedom of conscience protects our alignment, our freedom to live in alignment, that is, with our moral judgments, our moral convictions.
Freedom of conscience involves really the process of moral reasoning. And I think the fact is we all have a concept of what is good and how we should achieve the good. Really, freedom of conscience is quite key and fundamental to our democratic society. And it is a right that each person has, the right to actually take positive steps because your conscience dictates it, may be a little more subject to limitations under the Charter. But I think particularly the strongest aspects of freedom of conscience are this right, the lifeblood of the democratic system, to engage in moral reasoning, and the right to be protected from the state coercing unpopular conclusions about moral issues from being forced to violate their conscience. And that's really what the Charter protection, I think, focuses on. And issues of conscience and religion are, I think, very central issues. Freedom of religion, to a large degree now, is being seen by the courts as simply a personal, private choice that people make. I think it minimizes the fundamental nature of all kinds of belief commitments, including ones that we would commonly think of as religious, but somewhat broader than that. This is narrowing this issue. And part of the work that might be done by freedom of religion can, I think, be properly classed under freedom of conscience issues. But courts tend not to talk about freedom of conscience. They talk about freedom of religion because many conscience issues do overlap with religious issues. So they look at a case, they say, well, it's a religion case, but moral commitments aren't really core to religious belief, so really this isn't a very important issue, so it's dismissed. And I think one of the problems is that we are making our society vulnerable to a kind of moral totalitarianism that I think is a serious problem for a democracy. I mean, the majority has the right in law to express moral commitments and to make those part of the law. But under the Charter, what the Charter is supposed to be for is to protect the unpopular, the minority opinion, and to give it a strong protection so that it isn't just simply stomped out and oppressed. And that's just part of the democratic process. It ensures the possibility of change in a democratic society, which is absolutely crucial, and probably the thing that distinguishes totalitarianism from democracy.
Perhaps the hardest question, the most difficult question is, when is it justifiable or reasonable or okay for the state to limit or curtail those freedoms? We have a general understanding that none of these freedoms are absolute, that they have limits, but that's often the toughest question. That's where most of the battle is fought, so to speak. In terms of freedom of conscience, some of the easier cases, if I can put it that way, is when someone's conscientious conviction would lead them to perhaps harm others, destruction of property, or to disrupt society in a way that creates a lot of upheaval. Civil disobedience in some cases might be a situation in which freedom of conscience can be limited. But that might be a situation in which we say for peace and orderliness that it's okay for the state to limit that freedom. The tougher cases are perhaps where you see collisions of rights. So in healthcare, for example, is a common place where conscience comes up. You know, when is it okay for a doctor to conscientiously object to providing a certain service or even referring for a certain healthcare service? It's something that they view as being unethical or immoral. These are tough cases. They're cases that are being litigated now or have been recently litigated, and I'm sure will come up again. And there aren't easy answers to these questions. I take a robust view of freedom of conscience, that ultimately it should be given robust protection because one of the important parts of our humanity is moral reflection and seeking to be a moral society. It makes sense that we should, to the extent possible, allow for freedom of conscience to be cultivated and exercised freely, especially when there's ways in which maybe both sides of an issue can be accommodated. So allowing for disagreement, if I can put it that way, on matters of conscience, and for allowing people to live out that disagreement, to live and let live, to use a phrase that's used often. I think on balance, when we achieve that, it's probably the better option for us to follow.
So in my view, conscience protects the ability for someone to live life with integrity, publicly, personally, privately, professionally. In all of these spheres, we can live in the same way, and that's what conscience protects. So why conscience is important is it ensures that the state doesn't dictate moral and ethical positions. The state may take a position through legislation, but it doesn't dictate that everyone now has to adhere to that. It allows room for disagreement, for dissent, and for open discussion on important questions of morality and ethics.
When we think of religious freedom, there are a number of activities that are indicative of that freedom. Those would be the ability to be able to preach and be able to speak, express one's opinion with respect to matters that are answering the big questions like where did I come from, where am I going, what is the purpose and meaning of life, those kinds of questions. Then religious freedom also allows the ability of religious communities to be able to meet and assemble without any fear of hindrance or reprisal in various buildings. They can buy buildings and meet in those buildings, churches, parish halls, those kinds of things. Then they also have the ability, which was very interesting, was the concept of mobility, to be able to go wherever it is you want to go. And when you think about the historical context of that, it was important for preachers to be able to go and spread the message, the truth as they understood it, to various communities around their areas where they lived. Religious freedom then has a very broad effect on society as a whole. When you have freedom in your local church and freedom in being able to accept or reject or with respect and be able to debate various opinions, then you move that freedom then into other spheres of life.
I think it's emphatically true that freedom of religion isn't a forgotten freedom. It's not a freedom that has been under-examined by the courts or by scholarship. What I find interesting in terms of thinking about freedom of religion in conversation with what we forget is really what we see and what gets captured in freedom of religion, and what parts of a complex social world of religious difference, religious pluralism, is carved out or left as residue from what Section 2A, our Charter Protection of Freedom of Religion, ends up protecting. And so the contribution I'm making to the workshop today focuses on how claims made by Indigenous communities to issues of freedom of religion are imperiled, are challenged, meet obstacles when we look at the way that the court imagines first the character of religion and what appropriate limits on religious freedom are. And so the missing piece, the forgotten piece that I'm interested in looking at in my work right now is what parts of a complex religious and spiritual world are carved away from what our law, what our courts recognize, and what therefore gets protected under freedom of religion. And even more specifically right now, how Indigenous communities' claims to the protection of religious freedom work and don't work in light of very complex histories and very complex case law around religious freedom.
An example that comes to mind that I think is really relevant and what makes conscience extremely important is assisted death and euthanasia. Just because something is legal and the state has taken a position doesn't then mean that that is a moral obligation on everyone, or that it's even the ethical decision to make. And we need to have room within the profession of medicine, other regulated professions as well, for doctors to conscientiously dissent and object. And that's a key reason why we need this freedom. The state should not be able to dictate everyone's conscience. Of course, there are limitations to all freedoms, but the state bears a heavy burden in order to justify infringing those freedoms.
I think that there might be some anxiety, especially in some evangelical religions, about whether or not there's going to be encroachment on their ability to actually spread their religious message. And so I think that it has like a real practical, kind of taps into some practical emotions about what can we as religious people do? What can we say to people? And are we going to be free to do that? And proselytizing, trying to convince, can raise some people's ire, right? And I think the question of whether or not that's a protected form of religious expression and religious action is a question a lot of people have. One of the things I think is really promising looking at the freedom of expression protected in Section 2B of the Charter is there are these values and these principles that undergird, as for lack of a better term, freedom of expression, and that includes self-fulfillment, participation in public dialogue, and these types of things. And the courts have found that your expression, including religious expression, should be restricted or can be restricted when it interferes with the realization of these values in other people, right? So it's a more complex way of saying you can't be restricting other people's ability to actually meaningfully participate and decide in a conversation about religion when you're trying to proselytize them. So there would be some real limits to that, but I think that you would encourage proselytizing in a positive way, right? It's actually, I think it could be seen as a positive social good to actually engage with other people about religious ideas. And that also you can see in the protections of freedom of expression.
I don't see questions of the interaction of religious freedom with other rights or the ways in which we understand religious freedom in a highly normatively plural society. I don't see those questions going away. And so I think these are the sorts of issues that public policymakers, legislators, courts, and indeed us as members of the community are going to keep talking about and need to keep talking about quite intensely.
We've created this video series for you, and we hope that through this series, you'll learn a little bit more about the guarantees that you enjoy in Canada.